restoration is something that is often thought to be on the same lens as planting trees. So, can you share a particular example of, or any story, where essentially we have heard you say this a lot of times, that restoration actually begins with trust and not with trees. So, if there is any story that kind of exemplifies how this notion can be applied on the ground and what it means on the ground, maybe you can share something around that.
Yeah, I think generally restoration is really, it's a very vast topic, a very vast subject, and quite a lot of disciplinarity comes into play. And so far, people who use restoration immediately to convince the people who are sponsoring that kind of venture comes into, it's diluted to just basic planting trees. But that's not really the case. Ecology needs to get repaired. Even if you consider forest needs to be restored, trees are not just the only thing, right? There are shrubs, there are herbs, there are insects. It's a flora, fauna, the entire organizations within that standing mass, how they work together in tandem with each other, how each one actually fulfills a particular niche where they are operating and trying to fix the entropy into the larger thing so that the system as a whole stabilizes itself. Having just series of plants might not yield that kind of results. And to do so, you would require trust of people for a very simple fact that we as a practitioner or as a scientist cannot claim to know the history of that landscape. What was that history 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? 100 years is just 3 generations for Earth. That is just like a blink of an eye, That kind of knowledge actually comes from people. And people will share that kind of knowledge only if they trust you. If there had been instances from my own mentor, late Sri Prakash Bole, who was the founder of Ecological Society. They worked on grassland restoration, wetland restoration in Maharashtra. And people started benefiting from it. But just because of certain vested interests or political instability, all those restoration efforts were actually curtailed. People actually throw stones and destroyed all those landscape that was being worked around. People's ownership and trust is prerequisite. Nature bounces back itself. If you are able to manage people, 50% of restoration work is done. And how will you manage people is only if there's a trust in what you are offering. And trust is actually gained only if you really put all your expectations, all your interests very in an honest way, in a transparent way on a table. People are very smart on the ground. They live there on everyday basis. We cannot really consider them that they don't understand science or things like that. One of our very close friends from KTK Bell, they have this kind of something very beautiful. They say that farmers are professors, meaning that they understand, they toil the soil every day, right? They understand the relationship between the plants and things like that. And to cite an example, we are no longer working in Nepal on that project. We exited from there. But that example is one that I could cite, how the trust is actually very critical. We were working there on restoration of wetland. And the purpose was to bring back the avian diversity and density. Meaning, in the historical past, Kushitapu Wildlife Reserve is actually in Nepal's first Ramsar site, which is wetland of very important significance because it's a home and resting place or refuge to loads and loads of migratory birds. But over the period of time, because nobody managed those wetlands, invasive species have taken over. 90% of the wetlands in periphery of those things is infested with the water hyacinth, which is an exotic species and invasive species, and taifa, which is a resident species but very aggressive. So it's an indigenous species but still aggressive things.